Hello. It is my pleasure as director of the Toby Center for Jewish Life and Learning to welcome you to today's TJHT Talks session. We know that you have many webinars and hopefully an increasing number of outside activities to choose from, and we're very pleased that you chose to join us. Before I introduce our guest scholars, a few guidelines for those of you who are joining us for the first time. This conversation will last approximately 45 minutes, with 15 minutes at the end for Q&A. Please let us know where you are at the moment, or to submit a question, please do so in the chat box. If you would like to propose a topic for a possible future talk, please let us know in the chat as well. It is now my privilege to introduce Professors Natalia Alekshin and David Myers. Natalia Alekshin is a professor of modern Jewish history at the Graduate School of Jewish Studies, Touro College in New York. Her book, which inspired this discussion, Conscious History, Polish Jewish Historians Before the Holocaust, is soon to be published by the Littman Library of Jewish Civilization. Natalia, congratulations.
Thank you.
David Myers is the Sadie and Ludwig Kahn Professor of Jewish History at UCLA, where he serves as the director of the UCLA Luskin Center for History and Policy. David, too, is a prolific author and editor in the field of Jewish history, and among his many works and publications is The Stakes of History on the Use and Abuse of Jewish History for Life. A warm welcome to you both. We're delighted that you're with us. David, I turn the mic over to you.
Thank you, Helise. Such a delight to be with you and such a delight to be in conversation with Natalia. We're here to really talk about what is going to be an event on the Jewish scholarly calendar, the appearance of Natalia's long-awaited book on Polish Jewish historiography, Conscious History. We're going to be talking about it and the issues raised in it over the course of the next 45 minutes. But I do want to just say hello to you, Natalia. What a great pleasure it is to be in conversation with you. And maybe you can tell us a little bit about the book, how you came to it, what you tried to do with it. And I know you have some slides to share some of the principal personalities in it. So welcome to you. And let's begin with that piece of our conversation. How'd you get to this project?
Thank you, David, and thank you, Toby Center, thank you, Helise, and thank you, my publisher. And this is the moment whenever I talk about this book, when I say that this book happened because of David Myers' book, Reinventing the Jewish Past, European Jewish Intellectuals and the Zionist Return to History, which I read in grad school at NYU. And it was really a transformative experience, one of those books that make you think differently about your own work. So to have you with me on the screen, I could not be happier. But of course, there's also a personal connection to this book, which I realized slowly, rather towards the end of writing it, how much this was a personal story. A personal story in a way, because I myself went to University of Warsaw for my first PhD. I went to the same building when my cohort studied. I went to the same university library building. I used the same cards before they were digitized in the library. Many of my teachers studied with the teachers of Polish Jewish historians in the interwar period. And then there was also a case of serendipity when I realized, writing the epilogue of the book, that one of the young Jewish historians that I discussed, Franciszka Wiesenfeld, if I can ask for the next slide, Franciszka Wiesenfeld from Kraków, whose file I studied and her dissertation was in fact Tzafrira Azrieli, the mother of my first Hebrew teacher at Hebrew University in Jerusalem, whom I met in the course of my ulpan, but I didn't realize that she was the person I should have asked about her experiences with Meyer Bauerban and other fellow young historians. So in a way, there is all that connection, and this is a collective biography of a cohort of Polish Jews who came to look at the production of knowledge, a production of and dissemination of knowledge about the past of Polish Jewry as an important tool in shaping not only the culture of Polish Jewish community, but also contemporary status, situation, relationships, both within Polish Jewish community, but also with non-Jewish Poles. It is also a book about many geographic shifts and many intellectual temporal continuities, if I could ask for the next slide. So the bulk of the book is about the Second Polish Republic, but it starts with the project of writing Polish Jewish history in the 19th century and in the early 20th century. And this project travels from Warsaw to Galicia, and then from Galicia back to Warsaw, where almost all of my historians, if I can claim them in that way, attended the university. It is also about generational shifts and generational continuities. And again, the next slide. As I move from the generation of pioneers, of Galicianer historians and intellectuals, who were the first generation of university-trained historians who started writing Polish Jewish history from within that academic context of mainly Polish historiography, but also Austrian historiography, and then shift to the next slide and to the generation of whom probably the one name you heard of, you read about, is Emanuel Ringelblum in his role as the founder of Onek Shabbat, of Warsaw Ghetto Archive. But he has an academic history of a doctoral student at Warsaw University. Here you see his diploma, writing about early modern Polish Jewish history, in particular about Warsaw. And if I can ask for the next one, what's fascinating for me in this young cohort is the appearance of women. Among them, there were some 1/3 of young aspiring historians were women, some of them writing about women's history in ways that are really very contemporary if we look closely at how they set out to take this task on. And Sarah Eisenstein is one of those. I actually, just like in the case of many of these young historians, I don't know what happened to her. These are often biographies that are interrupted by the war. And to the next slide, I'm interested in how they became trained at the University of Warsaw, on the one hand, welcoming with the role of Maurycy Handelsman, one of the founders of Polish historiography in this period. On the other hand, university, which was introducing ghetto benches in the late 30s. You see here calls for the introduction of ghetto at the university, where violence was endemic against Jewish students, especially in the 1930s. So how these two factors, a rather welcoming intellectual atmosphere on the one hand, and the pressure and the growing pressure of othering of Jewish students and Polish Jews in general, how it affected that project of writing Polish Jewish history. They have all academic ambitions, and they are all interested in publishing in academic journals, especially in Poland, but also abroad. But they also are all public intellectuals, public minority intellectuals. Next slide. And that means that they involve in their activities broader public. Here, just one call for collecting Pinkasim communal records signed by all the important male historians of the time: Dubnow, Bauerban, Ringelblum, Schipper, And so this is a project not just purely academic, not just about ivory tower, which is important, but also about a communal, collective project of documenting and disseminating. Next slide. I'm also interested in how these young men and women realize their role as public intellectuals. And one of these important places for them are schools. Here is Bella Mandelsberg, one of the founders of Junger Historiker, of an informal group of Jewish historians at Warsaw University, who actually worked at the gymnasium in Lublin, such as many of those young historians. Next slide. Another example is Hillel Zeidman, who was political activist of Aguda Israel, who is working at the Jewish community in Warsaw, but also envisioning creation of a professional archive of the history of the Jews in Polish lands, one that doesn't come into being, but shows where this project is going in terms of building infrastructure. Next slide. And then another aspect of this public intellectual activities are rabbis. Especially interesting for me are military rabbis, because they interact with Jews who are drafted to the Polish army. They preach to them, they take the oath, they write special prayers. In all of this, Polish Jewish history plays a very important role. Now, this is the story that ends abruptly with the Holocaust, but the book also asks a question about continuity, about the degree to which this project had some continued relevance, and I believe it does, beyond the destruction of the primary audience of this project, the 3.5 million Polish Jews. So I hope that we'll have a chance to, David, to talk about this as well. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you for that précis, Natalia. That really gives the audience a sense of what the book is about. I want to begin with a kind of big question, which is why historiography? Why devote a book to the study of historical scholarship, which seems to be at some level a very arcane pursuit? And others would say, I remember when I was writing the dissertation that became the book that you so generously mentioned at the beginning of your remarks, I told a senior historian in Jerusalem what I was working on. And this person said, working on a book about historiography, I mean, that's something you save for the end of your career. When you sort of have, after you've produced a body of serious historical scholarship, then you can study what your colleagues and their predecessors have produced. But you and I think, believe otherwise, that there's something very valuable, very important in studying the recorded historical record, in studying historiography. And what I'd like to ask you is, what does your study of this series of generations of Polish Jewish historians tell us about Poland and Polish Jewry?
Oh, this is a great question and a big one. So I must say, I also did not have the most enthusiastic response to when I told people very excitedly that I was going to write about historians. But there's several reasons why I thought that this project mattered. For once, if one looks at the cultural production of interwar Poland, Jewish cultural production, it becomes very quickly very apparent that historical tropes are everywhere. In speeches in the Polish parliament, in popular articles, in ceremonies organized in Jewish schools, in bulletins for youth movement. Of course, these are all kinds of histories. Not all of those historical narratives are about Polish Jewish history, but I was puzzled by the preponderance of historical references. The second issue was that it came from a book that I also found inspiring many, many years ago by my teacher at Hebrew University, Ezra Mendelssohn, of blessed memory, who wrote in his very important book on the history of Jews in East Central Europe that there was no Polish Jewry in 1918. However, there was Polish Jewry in 1939. And in my other hat, wearing the hat of Holocaust historian, this is very clear when you read testimonies of Polish Jews written during the Holocaust and in the aftermath. They write of themselves as Polish Jews. So I was puzzled by how this process of just a handful of intellectuals from some parts of this newly resurrected Polish Republic thought of themselves as Polish Jews. How do we get to the situation that the new generation is actually shaped with that collective identity? And can it all be blamed, as it were, on Romantic Polish poetry? Right? This is something that many Polish Jews remember in their autobiographies, in their memoirs, but can it all be Adam Mickiewicz's poetry? And I think that it's very closely connected with that popular project of thinking about this community, thinking of itself as rooted in its past. And this work is done by historians. And then the third reason that attracted me to this project was that it seemed to be one of the non-partisan projects. It's an axiom to think about Polish Jewry between the two world wars as extremely politically divided. And I can myself share a lot of anecdotes about families in which each sibling belonged to a different, dramatically different political movement. So that is one aspect. And at the same time, in this project, in this collective project, there seems to be a participation of men and women from different political ideas about future of diaspora, the future of Jews in Eastern Europe. We have left-wing Zionists, general Zionists, religious Zionists, Bundist communists, and they seem to share their interest and investment in the past. So all this came to push me, and then of course there was your book.
Well, I mean, what this adds up to is the sense that historiography, historical scholarship, is also a reflection of larger cultural trends in the society you're studying, and not just a reflection in dialectical fashion, a shaper of cultural trends. And one of the things you demonstrate, especially as you make your way through the generations, which perhaps we'll have a chance to drill down on, is that you have competing cultural visions reflected in historiography. You have, on one hand, an integrationist impulse, and then you have a more nationalist impulse. I wonder if you can speak to these competing impulses and how they operate in relationship to one another.
Yes, indeed. And these are impulses that actually you can sometimes see in the body of work of one person. I mean, they are not neatly divided between generations, which again makes it so much more interesting. Because these are, I was actually trying to make this book not just a history of ideas, but also social history of those who were writing. And so we have these complicated trajectories in which, on the one hand, people like the older generation that I showed for a brief moment, Mojżesz Szor, Meyer Bałaban, to slightly lesser extent Ignacy Itzhak Schipper, are writing very much within the context of Polish, general Polish historiography. And I need to add that interest and immersion in history is not unique to Jewish minority in Poland. This is very much part of the general Polish culture. And I think that this book also shows how there is a conversation on that cultural level as well. And so on the one hand, they are very much responding to what they perceive as lacking or missing the point in Polish historiography as Polish historians who are Jews. And at the same time, the impulse is to write a national history, taking cues from different places, from Dubnov, from Gretz, albeit critically. So they are in a way, in multiple conversations. Ringelblum is on the one hand deeply involved in showing how enmeshed Polish Gentile and Polish Jewish societies are in the early modern period. That there is, as he puts it, no Chinese wall dividing the two societies. But at the same time, as an active member of Poale Zion Links, he's very interested and involved in building Jewish historiography in Yiddish, which by definition is really not accessible to a general Polish audience. And in that one, he is a little more interested in sort of internal workings of Jewish communal institutions or class conflicts within a Jewish community. So I think that this is what makes that this cohort across at least 2 or 3 generations so multifaceted, that they are multilingual, not just in terms of languages in which they read and write, but multilingual in terms of conversations that they want to contribute to.
They embody, in fact, sometimes competing impulses, or at least impulses that stand in some measure of tension. So an accommodationist, integrationist impulse and a national impulse may not be divided by competing camps or generations, but dwell in the same person. And you bring, such careful attention to that generation of the Second Polish Republic. Those are names that to students of modern Jewish history are known: Schipper, Shor, Balaban. I found really interesting your discussion of the prior generation, the generation of Handelsman and Ashkenazi, and sort of their standing within the Polish historiographical establishment, and their somewhat careful dance with the actual pursuit of Jewish historiography itself. Can you talk a little bit about that set of figures who are much less well known to students of modern Jewish history?
Oh, thank you for this question, because I painfully removed them from the presentation for the sake of time. And indeed, these two men who were in personal conflict with each other. So there is also a personal story to that. They are, I call them to myself, ambivalent Jews. They're Jewish, but at the same time, they are really Polish historians, and neither of them write in any particular manner on Jewish topics. I was digging very deep, trying to see if they might have written some articles forgotten earlier in life, but they, Ashkenazi writes about Polish royal elections and is a historian of 19th century, and in fact, he's still being read because he has a fantastic style and flair in writing about Poland's struggles for independence in the 19th century. Handelsman is extremely diverse in his interests, but he's primarily interested in medieval and early modern European history. And again, his work is still being read at Polish universities, especially in the context of methodological approaches, not at all in his investment in any kind of development of Jewish historiography. And as you put it, they dance a very delicate dance, because both of them are actually interested in helping the development of Polish Jewish historiography. But this is a historiography, especially for Ashkenazi, I believe, that is somewhat censored by Polish state interest and Polish national interest, and there is a back and forth between him and Balaban, for example, or Shor. Handelsman has a more formulated vision in which Jewish historiography is part of a multifaceted historiography of Poland as Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. This is not ethnic Poles only, not Catholics only. This is historiography of all those who lived in Polish lands. So from this point of view, he's interested in bringing, for example, Meyer Bauerban to teach Jewish history at Warsaw University, and that appointment is absolutely revolutionary because of Handelsman influence. Bauerban starts teaching these seminars in 1927. This is before any such appointment is happening anywhere, including Columbia University, including Salo Baron. So they're more enabling than themselves intellectually stimulating work on those topics by themselves.
So, to someone familiar with modern Jewish historical scholarship, there are many familiar features that appear in the writing of your Polish Jewish historians that invite comparisons to certainly Wissenschaft des Judentums, to German Jewish scholarship, that foundational movement from the early 19th century. And amongst those features are a keen interest in relations between Jews and Christians, non-Jewish inhabitants of the land, local history, historical accounts that point to the antiquity of a Jewish presence in the land. It's for these reasons that you have collections like the Germania Judaica and the Gallia Judaica, and these features figure centrally in the Polish Jewish historians that you look at. And so I wonder, since the study of Wissenschaft des Judentums has been so central to modern Jewish intellectual history, how did you relate to it as you went about writing this book? Did you say, that account of modern Jewish scholarship with its Germanocentrism has neglected this very important chapter? Did you say this is a source of inspiration? Somewhere in between? And I would just conclude my question by pointing out those competing impulses that Michael Meyer has identified in an article that you quote in your book. On one hand, the impulse to produce a kind of scientific objective history, and another impulse to apply in a utilitarian or instrumental fashion scholarship toward some larger goal. That impulse presence in Wissenschaft des Judentums is also very much present in Polish Jewish historiography. So how do you see the relationship between these two very important historiographical establishments?
You kind of summarized it already, but I will just repeat it with a few more words.
Yep.
And this is exactly, in a way, my own reading of it is guided by Polish Jewish historians' understanding of themselves and their relationship to this body of literature, which is, on the one hand, continuing. They see themselves as part of this impulse, but at the same time, and continuing by filling what has been left out. And so that important impulse that both the generation of Bauerban and Schipper and Shore, and then the younger generation, and Ringelblum writes about it explicitly, so does Bela Mandelsberg, about the fact that Polish Jewish historiography needs to catch up to what German Jewish historiography has already achieved. And so they don't necessarily position themselves as critics of, rather than followers who are bringing their own new perspective and the kinds of sources that German Jewish historians did not utilize, and so shifting the attention to the East. Now, there is, of course, also an element, and I think that's the big difference, is that they have a lot less ambivalence about traditional Jewish culture, about Hasidism, about Jewish autonomy, and that might be actually one point in which they also move beyond what I present in a book in the early chapter, this 19th century integrationist historiography, which very much mirrors that unease about what Ostjuden, what East European Jews might represent. The interwar Polish Jewish historians, many of whom actually come from Hasidic families to the extent that we can reconstruct their biographies, are very interested in exploring these histories and these institutions. So there is a continuity and a kind of creative setting their own stamp on this body, putting their own stamp on this body of literature. About the impulses, I very much agree that there are those contradictory impulses, and it goes to your previous questions as well, where historians of the same generation read Friedman and Ringelblum, for example, read one another and write critical reviews, sort of tracing and pointing to, you have done too much of apologetica, apologetica argument in your work, right? I understand there is a certain assumption of understanding that there is a need to point to Jewish contribution, to Jewish loyalty, to Jewish patriotism on a local level and on the national level, but also an awareness that this is problematic for objective historian of the past. So they are very much aware of these multiple lines that they're trying to write within and respond to these often contradictory impulses, as you put it.
So you described the project as a collective biography. It's actually a kind of generationally divided collective biography. And you began to tell us a little bit about this, but what were they like in terms of their Jewish disposition? Where did they come from Jewishly? And I imagine this differs by generation, but can you help fill in some of the color and flavor of that collective biography for our audience?
Yes, so I would focus on the interwar period because we only have that much time, and this is also the focus of the book. Just like we said it earlier, that in a way historiography is a reflection of broader cultural contours. They're representing all walks of life, as it were, of interwar Polish Jewry. And I was trying actually to sort of set certain geographic patterns at first, expecting that because the generation of the teachers has been primarily that of Galician background, that there might be more Galicianers among them. And so, yes, of course, there is Manuel Ringelblum and there is Rafael Mahler, and Hillel Zeidman comes from Eastern Galicia as well. But we find many of those who come from the so-called Kresy borderlands that were under the Russian partition, who come from small towns in the east, those from Congress Poland. So it's really a mix of, in terms of geographic background, which is, of course, not just about geography. In fact, university students each semester fill in a form in which they declare from which part of partitioned Poland they hail. So university wants to see that kind of background. It also means certain linguistic features. Galicia is a much more Polonized region than, say, the Russian part of Eastern Poland, and then that of Congress Poland. I expected to see more students coming from intellectual background, but there are many in the files who are sons and daughters of small merchants, actually merchants who struggle increasingly in the 1930s. So their graduate work drags for many years because they simply cannot afford paying the university fees. And in some of the student files, we see that they still owe money to the university that they are, for example, expected to pay in 1942, which is rather telling. We know what was going on to Polish Jewry in 1942. So in terms of social background, religious background, they seem to have a very wide array of trajectories. And this actually, again, going back to why writing about historians is actually so exciting, because it raises a question of, if you are making such a tremendous effort, often an effort of the entire family, to send a son or a daughter, even more so, to Warsaw to study history. Right? This is not a law degree. This is not a degree in medicine, which are extremely sought after degrees by Jews, because they offer at least a chance of upward mobility. But does a degree in history do it? Only few of them will get positions at private Jewish gymnasia, and even those are not well paid. So this is a very precarious fate that they're choosing. And my sense is that something that I can't prove as well as I would like to, because those ego documents are very few. My sense is that this is a choice of passion for many of them. This is not a pragmatic choice, but that they are truly interested in studying and possibly writing that communal history of their own community.
Yes, plus ça change. Today, when one embarks upon a PhD, one does not do so with the expectation of receiving a tenure-track job at a first-rate institution. That is simply not the assumption one can operate with. Those who got jobs at the Tachkamoni or the Institute for Jewish Studies were the lucky ones, which leads me to my next question, which is, how are Polish Jewish historians received by the Polish university world, by the Polish academic world? We know that, from the generation of Handelsman and Ashkenazi, there was a almost desperate desire to not just receive an education, but find a permanent place in the Polish university system. And with very few exceptions, that was not possible. Leading one to recall Gershom Scholem's rendering of the German Jewish dialogue as an unrequited affair. How do you summarize the success, the reception of your historians by the larger Polish historiographical establishment?
Well, I think it's an ongoing relationship that is certainly having difficult time of crisis, especially in the 1930s, so much so that even someone with the status of Marceli Handelsman is walked from the tram stop to the university by volunteering students to protect him from possible physical assault from nationalist students. That tells you something about the atmosphere that the university space has reached. Here, I actually am in conversation with another magnificent work with Sam Cassos, who will write our history. And he argues that those Polish Jewish historians, he calls them counter counter historians, or rather engage in counter profession, stressing that they really stayed outside, even if they hoped for inclusion. I see it a little bit more positively. Polish academia, even in the 1930s, has pockets of liberal intellectuals, especially in the humanities. There is a left-wing university called Wolna Wszechnica Polska, the free university, where Marceli Majer Bałaban, is actually teaching as well. This is something that I hope one day will find its historian. This institution should really have its own historian. And so even though there is less of an explicit invitation coming from the top level of Polish historians. For example, Jewish historians are not invited to speak, to give papers at the congresses of Polish historians as they did earlier. But they still publish in Polish journals. They still are reviewed by Polish non-Jewish historians. And so I think, like much of this project, it is interrupted in mid-sentence. And we really cannot tell where this project would have gone beyond 1939. I think that there is still interest in having Jewish historians writing Polish Jewish history as part of broader Polish historiographical project.
So on one hand, one has to adopt a kind of realist perspective and understand the tensions, the frustrations, and the successes of the Second Republic generation. And on the other hand, one has to countenance the fact that it came to a crashing and devastating halt. And it's hard to resist engaging in what the literary scholar Michael Andrew Bernstein called backshadowing, sort of adopting a set of presentist lenses to read the past and see this as a tragic story. I'm just wondering how you resist that impulse, or whether or not you adopt, as I suggested in my email to you before this, so whether or not you resist a tragic implotment, as Hayden White might describe it.
I've been certainly trying to, and hopefully the readers will be able to tell for themselves. I was writing this book obviously with the knowledge of what was coming. This is a knowledge that is difficult to put away. And as I mentioned, seeing the files of students who were asking to delay their payment and promising that sometime in 1940 they might be able to pay back the debt. And I couldn't resist the temptation of running their names in a database of Yad Vashem victims of the Holocaust, trying to see what happened to them. But at the same time, I did try very consciously to read this intellectual project, this cultural project, in its moment. And even without necessarily seeing, for example, in Ringelblum, the founder of Warsaw Ghetto Underground Archive, or in Schipper, the historian who will be imploring his fellow inmates in Majdanek to document everything. All these men and women have had some history that goes beyond 1939, and few are histories of emigration, such as Rafael Mahler, who leaves before, such as Jankę Wszacki, who leaves for New York before, or Tzafrira Azieli, whom I mentioned earlier, who leaves for mandatory Palestine in 1937. So I was very much trying to resist it, and I hopefully succeeded.
Well, maybe just a final question before we open up on that theme. I mean, you spoke in referring to the heroic efforts of figures like Ringelblum and Schipper to continue to create history in the most extreme conditions. In extremis, you point to the stakes of history, and I can't avoid, even as I see Halise on the screen, I can't avoid asking you about the continuities that you hinted at the beginning, because we of course dwell in a world in which there are very fierce battles over history, over historical narratives, including and especially in Poland itself. And I'm just wondering what you think your study illuminates about the contestation of history today.
Two things, and again, I know what Helice's presence on the screen means, that we need to bring it to the end. But I will just say,
continue. Please continue.
I will just say two things, and then encourage everybody to read the book. One is all kinds of biographical continuities, discovering people such as Safrira, who taught Jewish history for decades in various small high schools in Israel, discovering people who then continued to write programs for Keren Kayemet in the US, etc., who were students of Balaban in the 1930s. So there is that line, or who wrote textbooks for Israeli schools in the 1950s. So there are those programmatic biographical lines of continuity, but there is one that is more general and that I found striking and possibly somewhat upsetting, which is to see how relevant this project continues to be. That the main impulse that was driving this project was inscribing Jews into Polish history, making sure that Jews see themselves at home in Poland, that non-Jewish Poles see Jews as part of Poland, and understand that there is no Polish history without Jews. And this is, in a way, an impulse that continues to be a driving force of how we write Eastern European and specifically Polish Jewish historiography today. And, I thought about it finishing the draft, that in a way I wish that this read as somewhat antiquated project and not as something that underwrites so much of contemporary books.
Yeah, I would just add a coda that draws from the German Jewish scholarly tradition. It was a sentiment expressed by Leopold Zunz and then again by Hermann Cohen, and it conveyed the idea that the emancipation of German Jews will only come with the emancipation of Wissenschaft des Judentums, of Jewish studies. In other words, the acceptance of the historical experience and narrative of Jews will be an essential precondition to the integration and acceptance of Jews as full equals. And it seems to me some of that truth carries over to the Polish case in the Second Republic and indeed today.
Thank you.
Natalia and David, thank you so much for bringing us to this particular point. I feel now that the next session with both of you should start off just here. You've paved the way to an incredible form of discussion about what you just both alluded to, both spoke to, in terms of what's going on today. And you had hoped, Natalia, that this was a historical reference and not a present one. We do have several interesting questions from the audience. From Marisha Galbraith, I was really intrigued that many of the Polish Jewish historians were women. What topics did they cover? What did they contribute to Polish Jewish historiography in general? How was their perspective different from that of their male counterparts? And was there a similar trend in non-Jewish Polish history? Could either of you? So this will be our third session together. Please, David, Natalia.
I would actually be very curious, David, if you addressed it even very briefly about the German cohort. But let me just say this about the Polish Jewish cohort, which is I don't know. I know their topics. However, the way that the academic culture had been and to some extent continues to be, is that you receive your topic from your Dr. Vater, from your advisor. So I don't know how much we can draw from what these women are writing about, because they likely received these topics. The one exception is Sarah Eisenstein, whom I showed you, a young woman from Łódź living in the heart of Jewish Warsaw, who wrote about Jewish women in the early modern period and calling on filling a gap in Jewish historiography. There isn't enough about women. We can't study rabbis all the time and communal institutions that are all about men. And as I was reading her dissertation, I thought this is likely the topic that was not given to her by Meyer Bauerban. This is very likely her own choice. So women are really present as a new part of the cohort, but it doesn't express itself in a new set of topics or in new methodological approaches. They write social history, institutional history, local history, just like their male counterparts. They often write about their hometowns. So their presence is new, not beyond. But this is important as well. David, I wonder how this compares to.
Yeah, I mean, it was striking to me to see the presence of as many women as you identified, some of whom you explicitly discussed and some of you just referred to numerically. It seems in some sense to be more receptive to, that is to say, Polish Jewish historical circles seem to be more receptive than what we see in German Jewish historical circles, certainly in the late 19th century. Of course, in the German Jewish scholarly world, you do have a very significant figure by the name of Selma Stern, who really played a large role in shaping an historiographical tradition devoted to the study of political history. One, perhaps might have assumed her interest would be elsewhere, but no, indeed, Stern's major contribution was to study Prussian Jewish political history. It probably is also worth mentioning Regina Jonas, who received rabbinical ordination in the early 1930s, who also undertook scholarly work as part of her rabbinical studies. But these are exception cases, and I think what your study suggests to us, Natalia, is that there were no doubt more women involved in scholarship in the German Jewish world than we have surfaced to date, or than had been surfaced in sort of the classic era of scholarship about German Jewish historical scholarship. Your book is an invitation to really probe more deeply, I would say, both in the context of Wissenschaft des Judentums and also in the Polish setting, where there's much more to be discovered.
Our second question, there are many. In the chat, there are several questions and comments, and actually, David and Natalia, there's a conversation going on, including from Rivka Schiller, about the Jewish historians, the Polish Jewish historians who survived the Holocaust. And then, as you mentioned, I think earlier, to Israel or to the United States, sometimes before the war, sometimes after. Can you tell us more about their contribution to Polish Jewish historiography after, post-war?
Oh, this is wonderful. I will not need to restrain myself. I think that there's an interesting phenomenon of writing with yet another sense of urgency. And I was thinking about David's question earlier about these big claims and big intellectual projects that Wissenschaft des Judentums sets, and the Polish Jewish historians seem much more modest in that respect. They work on the history of Jews in Polish lands, that they don't seek to define the nature of diasporic existence, or go beyond the centers in Poland in that historical inquiry. I could talk about Schipper's work on the history of Jewish commerce as a little bit of an exception. And then after the Holocaust, there's another sense of urgency, which is documenting and writing the history of the Holocaust. So at least two of the survivors, one who was brother-in-law of Ringelblum, Arthur Eisenbach, and Philip Friedman, are both historians of early modern history, and they take on the writing of the Holocaust. And I actually found a correspondence in which they say, well, maybe later on, I will be able to return to the study of Jewish history that I was doing before the war. But right now, the obligation is to document the destruction. So there is a dramatic shift in a way, but also a continuity. And I've been recently looking at Blätter für Geschichte, a fascinating Yiddish journal published before the Holocaust by the group of young Jewish historians, and after the Holocaust, the same title, taken on as a Yiddish language journal of the Jewish Historical Institute, which was in the building of the Institute of Jewish Studies, Machon Lechochmat Israel. So I expected that post-war journal to be all about the Holocaust. And then I discovered that they published Bauerbaum and Ringelblum and Schipper and pre-war historiography. So really, this is serving as a platform for explicit continuity, even in the most material, tangible way, as it is happening in the same building. So I think that the post-war story is even more complicated and complex that I suggested in my epilogue, and something I will need to return to. But thank you for this question.
I'll just add one addendum to Natalia's response. Of course, Polish Jewish historians make their way to Israel and the United States and practice their craft there. Raphael Mahler, Philip Friedman, whom Natalia mentioned. It's really important to note that in the late stages of the Holocaust and the immediate aftermath, there were scholars writing in the Yiddish language on the events unfolding in their time. As Natalia knows, there's a very fine book by a UCLA PhD student, Mark Smith, called The Yiddish Historians of the Holocaust, that studies this cohort, which is really complementary to Natalia's and Sam Kassa's Who Will Write Our History. These three works really, I think, elevate our understanding of Polish Jewish historiography. And what Mark Smith shows is not only that a cohort of historians is working in medias res, in the midst of the unfolding events, but that they foreshadow a good number of some of the standard features of Holocaust historiography as it would develop much later in the 1980s and 90s. These Yiddish historians are real conceptual and methodological innovators, writing in extremis, in the most extreme conditions. And they are really a bridge generation between pre and post.
Thank you, Natalia. Thank you, David. We have several more comments and questions, and you also have greetings from literally around the world, New Zealand, Brazil, and many people I'm sure that you know. We have our last question before we close is from Professor Dario Stola, who thanks you very much for your presentation. And his question is, can you elaborate on the political tensions between the key figures of Polish Jewish historiography?
In 1 minute.
Right. Yes. We'll give you a few more, at least to start the deep dive.
There are political tensions, but what I stressed earlier, what I find much more interesting than these tensions, because we know about the tensions between the Bund and the Zionists and the communists. This has been beautifully discussed by many scholars. What I find more interesting is that they sit together and discuss methodological questions and sources and approaches in writing history, that they meet together in popular courses that they organize for workers, for example, in Częstochowa, which is a heavily Bundist town, where Ringelblum is regularly teaching in Yiddish in the evening courses. So I think that those political tensions are surprisingly less important for this body of literature than one would expect. But this is just 1 minute answer, and Darek, I would love to continue.
Thank you. David, do you want to close this out?
Well, I would just say that what we have before us in conscious history is an extremely important piece in a larger puzzle that covers modern Jewish historical scholarship, which, as we discussed, is really both a reflection and, in a certain sense, a shaper of important cultural and political trends in the lived experience of Jews in Europe. Natalia has done a great service to the field of Jewish scholarship with this book, which many of us have waited for with great anticipation. And I must say, it exceeds the very high expectations we had for it.
Thank you, David. I'm going to have champagne now.
Thank you, Elise.
Oh, it's our pleasure. Before you go off for L'chaim, which you both richly deserve, David and Natalia, thank you for a very inspiring conversation. As I mentioned before, you've given us much to think about, but I think some topics for future TJH Talk conversation. We thank you for your time and your scholarship, and we look forward to your book soon reaching our shelves, Natalia. I want to also thank our TJH Talks team, Jakub Wyszek and Kaya Zizek. And thank you, audience. Thank you, dear participants, for joining us. This talk is supported solely by your contributions from you, and we thank each of you who has already contributed. And if you'd like to consider a contribution to make a one-time or recurring tax-deductible donation, you will find information in the email which will follow. We look forward to seeing all of you at our next talk, a special edition of TJHT Talks in partnership with the Krakow Jewish Culture Festival on Thursday, June 24th. We're delighted you could all be with us. For us here in Warsaw, it's the evening. We wish you a good evening, a good day, a good morning or afternoon, depending on where you might be. And we look forward to seeing you. Thank you to our guests, all of you in the audience. Thank you to our scholars. Please all stay well and safe.
Thank you.
Thank you.